A black CEO was restrained in his chair during boarding, but 15 minutes later, he turned the tables in a way that left the entire cabin stunned. A black CEO was tied to his chair during boarding, thinking he could be humiliated without consequence. He didn't realize that in just 15 minutes, the man everyone underestimated would unleash a response that left the cabin and crew stunned. Subscribe if you believe arrogance collapses the instant true authority awakens. Sir, I want to need you to step aside. The words were delivered without warmth, clipped and mechanical, like they had been rehearsed. Dr. Thurin Voss paused just steps from his assigned seat in first class. He turned slowly, eyebrows lifted not in protest, but in curiosity. The man addressing him wore the crisp uniform of a flight supervisor, Aaron Vale, according to his badge, and stood alongside a second, broader man with a shaved head and tight jaw, Trent Doran. Both men blocked the aisle with subtle but unmistakable intent. Thurin didn't speak right away. He simply looked at them. His grip on the leather handle of his briefcase didn't tighten, didn't tremble. Instead, his eyes scanned their posture, their stance, the microsecond delay in Doran's eye contact. Something was wrong. The boarding line behind him slowed to a crawl as murmurs began to rise. Passengers shifted uncomfortably. The usual pre-flight chatter dulled into a hush as the scene unfolded. "We flagged your tag," Aaron continued, holding up a scan pad. "There's been a security concern. Routine compliance check. Won't take long." Thurin studied the screen briefly, noting the fake alert symbol blinking at the top. Amateur work. He could see the misaligned data field that would have failed any real system audit. Still, he said nothing. He didn't nod, didn't resist. He simply let out a measured breath, then followed them down the short aisle without a word. They guided him into seat 3A, his own assignment, ironically, and forced him into the cushion with calculated precision. Aaron kept his tone professional, even as his hands gripped Thurin's shoulder a little too tightly. Trent produced a pair of white plastic zip ties from beneath his vest and began looping them around Thurin's wrists, binding them to the armrests of the chair. "Protocol," Trent said with a smirk, snapping the ties shut with unnecessary force. "Just until we get things sorted." Still, Thurin didn't react. His assistant, Arlen, seated quietly 2 rows ahead in 5C, turned slightly, one hand already adjusting the lens of his smart glasses to record. Their contingency signals had been clear before boarding. If anything unusual happened, document everything. "This will be quick," Trent muttered, leaning in close so only Thurin could hear. "Unless you make it complicated." Thurin's eyes lifted. Cool, unshaken, as if weighing the full weight of the insult and discarding it as irrelevant. The boarding process continued around them. Passengers slowed, stared, glanced away. A few clutched their children tighter. Others whispered behind hands. The sight of a well-dressed black man restrained in first class triggered assumptions. That much was expected. One man hesitated at the curtain divider, visibly torn between curiosity and fear. Another muttered, "They must have caught something serious." But nothing in Thurin's body language suggested fear. His spine remained straight. His legs did not fidget. Even the subtle tilt of his chin conveyed not submission, but containment, like a pressure valve holding back a truth no one else had the capacity to understand yet. Near the galley, a tall male flight attendant, Redden Corin, stood watchfully. His arms crossed, eyes sharp. He didn't speak, but his glances toward Thurin were too frequent, too deliberate. Redden wasn't merely observing. He was monitoring, coordinated. As the aircraft filled, the air turned thick with tension. The door hadn't even closed, and already, something about this flight had shifted from routine to sinister. Every movement seemed calculated. Every glance rehearsed. Thurin shifted slightly in his seat. The zip ties pressed deeper into the bones of his wrist. A lesser man might have winced. He didn't. Instead, he rolled the edge of his left cuff just enough to expose the underside of his watch clasp. Not for comfort, but for access. A nearly invisible chip gleamed there, embedded in the inner plate. Not a tracker, not a communicator. A key. A protocol safeguard only someone with his credentials could deploy. Not yet, he told himself. Not until the full scope revealed itself. He glanced toward Arlen, who nodded once, barely perceptible to anyone watching. The footage had already begun uploading to a secured channel maintained by Veltrix Systems. A silent alarm, visible to none but those the run had trusted. Layer 1 was activated. Aaron and Trent retreated without ceremony, leaving the Wren in plain sight. A restrained man in first class. A cautionary tale without words. But they hadn't accounted for the man they tied down. Because Dr. Theron Voss wasn't just another executive. He was the co-architect of the same digital engine intelligence humming quietly beneath this aircraft's floors. And more dangerously for the men who bound him, he was the federal advisor who had just vetoed the Viriline Protocol, a sweeping surveillance measure that Dominion Airlines had aggressively lobbied for and failed to pass. Which made this no coincidence. No misunderstanding. This was a message. And what they didn't know, what not a single person in that cabin yet understood, was that they hadn't silenced a threat. They had provoked a response. Theron exhaled through his nose, settling into the discomfort like it was armor. The straps bit deeper into his wrists, but still he didn't move. Didn't blink. The cabin doors began to seal. The engines purred with life. Redden Corin walked past once more, pausing near Theron's armrest. His voice was low, his smirk faint. You should have signed the protocol, Dr. Voss. Now you're part of our demonstration. Theron turned his head slowly. His voice, when it came, was soft, cold steel wrapped in calm. I hope you brought a parachute, he replied. Passengers whispered as they passed the restrained man in 3A, but none stopped. A few glanced quickly before lowering their eyes, unwilling to engage. Others stole longer looks, confusion evident on their faces. No one knew for sure who he was. To some, he looked dangerous. To others, simply out of place. But to all, he was now a spectacle, zip-tied, silent, and still. Theron Voss sat motionless, shoulders squared despite the flex cuffs biting into his wrists. Across the aisle, flight attendant Redden Corin lingered near the galley like a quiet shadow. He was tall, pale, and unreadable, his expression cold, his posture rigid. Every few seconds, he turned his head slightly, eyes narrowing toward the run, then back again. Watching, waiting, as if daring the man to speak. But Theron didn't. He didn't move. He didn't flinch. His eyes remained fixed ahead, scanning every reflection in the cabin's polished surfaces, every crew movement, every whispered exchange. His breathing was steady, almost too calm. And that calm unnerved Redden more than defiance ever could. Hidden behind that calm was calculation. Beneath his neatly pressed sleeve, Theron nudged the edge of his cuff just far enough to expose the underside of his watch clasp. Embedded there, invisible to scanners unless specifically sought, was a thin metallic chip, not a tracker, not a transmitter. A key, one he had designed himself. A key to a silent protocol engineered for one scenario only, strategic isolation under duress. And, judging by the tightening of the plastic restraints around his wrists, that protocol had just become necessary. 3 rows back in 5C, Arlen Maris, Theron's assistant, sat with his head tilted as if adjusting an earpiece, but his fingers were moving in a very specific rhythm across his seat console. He wore no expression, only focus. Inside his ear, the signal had already begun uploading. The footage from his glasses, footage capturing Theron being forced into 3A, zip-tied without resistance, mocked by the very crew meant to protect passengers, was now climbing a private encryption ladder toward the Veltrix satellite cloud. No one on the plane knew that Dominion Airlines had just begun losing control of its narrative. A few minutes earlier, Redden had leaned in with quiet malice. You should have signed the protocol, Dr. Voss, he'd said, breath hot and bitter. Now you're part of our demonstration. He was referring, of course, to the Viriline Protocol, the proposed aviation surveillance framework that the run had vetoed just 3 weeks earlier. On paper, it sounded like safety, dynamic passenger behavior scoring, automated crew discretion zones, AI-enforced detainment tags. In reality, it was a loophole-laced power grab. Dominion Airlines had poured millions into lobbying for it. They needed public proof that opposition to the protocol endangered flights. And now, somehow, their opponents were being seated in restraint, mid-air, under cameras, surrounded by silence. Theron's jaw tightened slightly. He hadn't spoken since boarding. He had allowed them to tie his wrists, drag him into 3A, and ignore every ID and credential he presented. Why? Because he knew what mattered wasn't what they did to him. It was who saw it. And they had made a fatal mistake. Reden's words replayed in his head. "You're part of our demonstration." Theron had not blinked. His response had been low, quiet, and laced with warning. And now, he repeated it under his breath once more, not for Reden's benefit, but his own, anchoring himself, clarifying his next step. "I hope you brought a parachute," he said. 15 minutes into taxiing, Theron Voss sat motionless in seat 3A, wrists zip-tied to the armrests, the cold plastic biting into his skin like a quiet insult. The hum of the engines outside was nothing compared to the murmurs weaving through the cabin. Conversations faded when eyes landed on him. Some passengers whispered guesses: terrorist, criminal, maybe even a violent protester. None dared ask questions. Few dared think critically. But Theron wasn't watching them. He was calculating. With every blink, every breath, he traced the architecture of the aircraft in his mind. The passenger manifest had revealed no high-risk individuals. The flight crew rotations showed a suspicious substitution. 2 mid-level supervisors on the manifest who weren't on the original rotation report. He recognized the names: Trent Doran and Aaron Vale, both previously flagged in a non-public oversight report he had declined to redact just 3 weeks earlier. That report was still sealed, or so he thought. Reden Koren loomed near the front galley, arms folded like a statue, trained to guard a prisoner. His glance toward Theron was cold, calculating, but also oddly casual. The kind of look that came from someone confident the target couldn't retaliate. Trent Doran, on the other hand, was enjoying the moment far too much. He leaned in close to one of the flight attendants near the service station and whispered loud enough to be heard across the aisle. "Imagine our nation's newest aviation watchdog," he said, smirking, hog-tied like a lost passenger. A few quiet chuckles followed. Not all cruel, some nervous, some just attached. But Theron didn't respond. Not with words. Instead, he subtly shifted his left wrist, rotating the embedded clasp on his cufflink. A tiny click activated a buried node in his watch clasp, a harmless-looking analog device to most, but to Theron, it was a trigger, a signal, a call for leverage. 2 rows behind him, Arlen Reel sat perfectly still, hands resting on his knees, appearing calm. But in his right ear, a barely visible earpiece blinked once green. He leaned slightly, pulled out his tablet from the seat pouch, and tapped a hidden sequence. On screen, a quiet command ran through a private backdoor in the aircraft's digital backbone. This wasn't illegal. Not yet. The backdoor had been designed by Veltrix Systems, the very company Theron led. And this aircraft, like many in Dominion's new fleet, was built on that framework. The override was silent. No alarms, no flashing lights. Just a soft chime, one the average passenger would attribute to a seatbelt warning or drink service. But Theron recognized it. So did someone else. Row 9, aisle seat. A tall man with a military straight posture sat up, closed his book, and tucked it neatly into the seat pocket. His name was Drellin Kane. To others, he was a travel consultant. To Theron, he was contingency. Planted weeks ago, just in case. Drellin stood, adjusted his jacket, and walked forward, the cabin growing quieter with every step. He passed a teenager with earbuds, a man cradling a sleeping infant, and a pair of businessmen too engrossed in emails to notice anything. But when he reached row 3, he stopped and spoke loud enough for both crew and passengers to hear. "Excuse me, gentlemen," he said, his voice crisp but calm. "I need to speak to the man in 3A." Trent rose from his jump seat with mock authority, planting himself in the aisle. "That passenger's under compliance watch," he said, squaring his shoulders. Drellin didn't flinch. He reached into his blazer and pulled out a badge, black, rectangular, and unmistakably official. The crest of the Federal Aviation Integrity Council gleamed under the cabin lights. "Not anymore," Drellin said flatly. "He's undermined now." Thurin looked up at Drellin, and for the first time since boarding, the edge of a smile tugged at his lip. It wasn't relief, it was recognition. The game had begun. "Not anymore," Drellin said, holding up his federal badge. "He's undermined now." What followed next was not chaos, it was silence. Dense, disorienting silence. The kind that doesn't come from calm, but from a sudden rupture in expectation. Every eye in the cabin turned as Drellin Kane stepped forward, cutting through the aisle like a blade through fog. He moved with deliberate control, his posture straight, his gaze unreadable behind thin-rimmed glasses. The passers-by, previously murmuring about the restrained man in 3A, now hushed altogether. Something had shifted. Drellin didn't make a scene. He simply arrived at Theron's row, pulled his coat slightly open, and revealed a small, metallic device clipped to his belt. It resembled a penlight, but was in fact a certified restraint cutter. With one fluid motion, he extended the tool, crouched beside Theron's armrest, and sliced clean through the plastic zip ties. They snapped sharply, like twigs under pressure, the sound echoing louder than it should have in the charged quiet. No one spoke. Thurin remained still for a beat. The pain in his wrist throbbed, but he didn't wince or rub the marks. He slowly stood, shoulders square, gaze fixed forward. His silence carried more weight than shouting ever could. Red Corin took a single step forward, nostrils flaring, his voice laced with confusion and menace. "You're interfering with protocol," he barked, fists clenched tightly. Drellin turned his head, just slightly, holding up a gleaming ID badge, now fully illuminated from his tablet. "No," he said, voice low and precise. "You're violating Code 9B of the Passenger Dignity Act." The words hung in the air like a warning bell. Trent Doran, stationed just a few feet away, visibly stiffened. His foot slid back involuntarily, as though retreating from a blast he hadn't yet heard. The rules they had weaponized seconds ago were suddenly being turned against them, with receipts. Thurin stepped into the aisle. "No spectacle, no threats." He moved with the eerie calm of someone who had been planning not just survival, but reversal. He nodded once to his assistant, Arlen, seated several rows ahead. Without a word, Arlen tapped a hidden command into his seatback panel. A silent pulse spread through the cabin's digital infrastructure, triggering the next phase of their quiet retaliation. Seatback systems across the cabin flickered, momentarily dimming before stabilizing. In the background, unseen by most passengers, a secure data tunnel had been activated, linking all internal crew communication to a protected Department of Transit Oversight cloud. Every whisper, every message from that moment on was now evidence. The system labeled each stream, flagged anomalies, and time-stamped every vocal cue. "Just so we're clear," Drellin said, taking a step back to face the entire cabin crew. "This aircraft is now under active federal observation. If any crew member touches a passenger without legal cause or authorization, that act will be classified as a federal violation under aviation compliance law." There was a visible shift in the air. Even the passengers who had been passive observers were now leaning forward, eyes wide, phones recording. The energy wasn't curiosity anymore. It was anticipation. The tide was turning. Thurin turned to face the front galley. The intercom glinted beneath the overhead light. He stepped forward slowly, his movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. His voice, when it came, was calm but thunderous in implication. "You had 15 minutes of power," he said clearly, facing the crew. His tone didn't rise, didn't need to. "You've got 60 seconds to surrender control, or you'll wish this plane never left the gate." Reda moved first, but not toward Thurin. He pivoted sharply on his heel, stepping backward with the calculated speed of someone who knew exactly where the leverage point was. His hand shot toward the emergency control panel near the galley bulkhead, fingertips outstretched, ready to execute whatever last-ditch command he believed might tilt the balance back in his favor. But the run was already moving. With a calm precision that seemed to ripple through the tense cabin like a silent detonation, he activated the embedded voice lock feature nestled beneath the second notch of his collar. something no crew member on board even knew existed. The moment his voice triggered the encrypted command, the cabin lights flickered once, stuttered, and then turned crimson. A deep hush rolled across the rows. The change in lighting was no accident. It was protocol. Manual mode had been activated. The Veltrix failsafe, designed for in-flight system neutralization during internal sabotage threats, it rerouted power from automatic operations and rerouted control through a restricted chain keyed only to certified federal liaisons, which at that moment meant they were in Voss. Passengers flinched at the sudden change in atmosphere. The once sterile cabin now pulsed with red hues like a silent alarm in a submarine. Whispers escalated to murmurs. Phones emerged from pockets. Cameras rolled. Fear turned into curiosity, and curiosity into something sharper. Awareness. Near row 10, a passenger leaned into the aisle to get a better view, eyes narrowing at the sight of a man, moments ago restrained, now standing and commanding the ship's nerves. From mid-cabin, Aaron Vale stormed forward like a general regaining lost territory. His gait was hard, stomping with fury, his voice loud enough to startle even the inattentive. "This is a security breach," Aaron shouted. "Your override is illegal." The Ren turned to face him, unflinching. "So was yours," he said, stepping into the aisle, his tone low but resonant. "And now the federal channel is live." At that exact instant, every entertainment screen on the aircraft blinked and shifted. Gone were the cheerful menus and paused movies. In their place appeared a stark blue background with bold white text that read, "Internal violation detected, transmitting to federal oversight." Gasps spread through the cabin like ripples across water. The symbol in the lower corner, an eagle perched atop a balance scale, confirmed this wasn't a bluff. The Department of Transit Oversight was now watching in real time. The entire aircraft had become a sealed container of evidence. Aaron froze mid-step. The fire in his eyes didn't fade, but it dimmed. Because now, he wasn't just confronting a passenger. He was confronting the system he'd tried to bypass, and it had responded. Behind him, Trent Doran backed up into the bulkhead, pale, trembling. The sweat on his brow glistened under the red lights, as if the truth itself had begun to melt his composure. His voice was a thin thread. What are you?" Doran didn't stop walking. He passed Trent with the authority of a storm that had simply changed direction. His eyes didn't even meet the man's. "Accountability," he said coldly. "In a seatbelt." He reached the galley and turned, scanning the faces of the crew who once laughed, once mocked, once believed they held the leash. Then, with a calmness that chilled more than rage ever could, he addressed them as if delivering a lecture. "Now sit down, gentlemen, and let me show you what 15 minutes of restraint feels like when the hands are finally free." Durin Voss rose slowly to his feet, the crimson glow of the locked-down cabin systems casting a surreal light across his face. The cabin wasn't loud. It was silent in the way a courtroom holds its breath after a verdict. Rows of passengers, some filming, others frozen in stunned attention, watched as the man once zip-tied to a seat now calmly walked toward the flight intercom, the soft click of his shoes the only sound that dared interrupt the moment. Flight attendant Redden Corin stood stiff against the galley wall, his fists tight at his sides. His earlier sneer had vanished, replaced with a look of rigid calculation. Trent Doran, still halfway down the aisle, shifted uncomfortably, his shoulders hunched as though trying to disappear into his uniform. Aaron Vale was pale, his hands trembling slightly as the Ren passed him without a glance. The very weight of the moment seemed to press down on all of them, because in every pair of watching eyes, the power had changed hands. "Captain Doss," the Ren said, his voice calm, deliberate. "I'm requesting access to the intercom." The cockpit door remained closed for a heartbeat longer than it should have. Then a soft beep. The channel opened. The Ren lifted the handset and looked out at the cabin, at the businessmen with their loosened ties, the teenagers with half-finished sodas, the father with a sleeping child on his shoulder. Every face was turned toward him, no longer with suspicion, but with hope. "Passengers," he began, voice steady and resonant. My name is Dr. Thurin Voss. You may have seen me forcibly restrained during boarding. That act was illegal. This flight is no longer under the control of a private carrier's intimidation tactics. I advise you to remain calm as we transition to federal oversight. A collective stillness followed. Then, subtle nods, quiet exhalations, a slow release of fear. Someone near the back whispered, "He's the guy they tied down." Another responded, "He's the guy fixing it now." From row 5, Arlen glanced at his screen. The final phase of the breach report was nearing completion. He tapped a sequence, secure encryption, military-grade relay, uplink engaged. The report streamed live to the Office of Transit Conduct. Every second of internal crew comms, passenger footage, and system logs forming a data trail impossible to refute. But then, the cabin speakers crackled again. This time, it wasn't Thurin. "This is your captain, Laren Doss," came the hesitant voice, barely holding composure. "We are currently experiencing electrical interference. For safety reasons, we are considering a return to the departure airport." Heads turned. Confused murmurs spread. Arlen's eyes narrowed. That made no sense. The system had been stable for the past 5 minutes. Thurin didn't move at first. Then his brow furrowed, and his fingers tapped swiftly on the seatback console nearest him. A diagnostics scan swept across his screen. No errors, except one. A low-bandwidth disruption signal localized. Not from the systems he and Arlen controlled. Something else. Thurin muttered. "Trace it." Already ahead, Arlen's fingers danced over his tablet. "It's not internal. It's not from our override." A beat later, his screen pulsed red. "Found it." Thurin turned sharply, eyes locking onto the crew storage locker embedded near the rear lavatory wall. Drellin Kane, already scanning from his seat, was on his feet in seconds. He moved swiftly, stepping over a startled beverage cart and cutting across the aisle. Passengers leaned aside, some gasping. Drellin reached the locker, unlatched it, and paused. From the outside, it looked like a simple flashlight. Regulation issue. Black grip. No laves. But it was heavier than it should have been. He twisted the base. Inside, not batteries, but a tightly packed micromodulator wrapped in a foam casing. His expression darkened. "It's a signal dampener," Drellin announced quietly to Thurin, holding it aloft. Cloaked inside equipment. Blocks comms, data uplink, even surveillance feeds. Thurin's jaw clenched. This wasn't just improvisation by angry crew. It was planned. Hidden tech. Pre-installed. The type of tool used when someone wanted to suppress exposure from the inside. He turned back toward the front of the plane. "This is premeditated," he said, loud enough for the passengers to hear. "And whoever placed this didn't intend to get caught." Trent bolted. He lunged toward the cockpit, wild-eyed, hoping to reach the captain's console. Passengers shouted. One man tried to stop him, but was shoved aside. "Trent, don't!" Aaron barked, his voice cracking. Thurin didn't raise his voice. He simply stepped into the aisle and lifted one hand, palm out. "If he touches that door," he said, eyes on the cockpit, "the entire aircraft locks down under dual security protocol." Trent froze mid-step. He turned slowly, the color draining from his face. The authority in Thurin's tone wasn't bluster, it was law. Inside the cockpit, Captain Doss's voice came again, more fragile now. "Is this aircraft being hijacked?" Thurin stepped forward until he stood just outside the cockpit threshold. His voice, when it came, was cold and clear. "Only by the people you hired." Drellin handed the dampener to Thurin, who placed it gently into an evidence pouch. His movements were calm, almost methodical. Then he turned back to face the rest of the crew. "From this moment," Thurin said, his voice unwavering, "no one moves without authorization from either the Department of Transit or myself." He took 2 steps toward Redden, whose jaw twitched with the weight of fear, not defiance. The man who once guarded the galley with smug silence now seemed hollow, his shoulders sinking beneath the weight of exposure. "You wanted to make a statement," Thurin said, each word deliberate, each syllable laced with steel. "You wanted to demonstrate what happens when someone like me says no to your control scheme." He took one final step. "No threats. No shouting. Just absolute control. So let's finish the demonstration, with all of you as the example. The flashlight hit the metal tray with a soft clunk, but Drellin Kane's hands were anything but casual. He twisted the casing open with precise turns of his gloved fingers, ignoring the curious glances from nearby passengers and the frozen expressions of crew members now clustered near the galley. Inside the hollowed-out handle, where batteries should have been, sat something far more advanced, a matte black core with silver nodes and a curved microarray, barely the size of a coin. His breath caught. "A signal dampener," Drellin muttered, holding it up to the light. Thurin stepped beside him without speaking, his eyes fixed on the device. He didn't need a second look. He knew what it was. "It's a micromodulator," Drellin continued, now pulling out a secure pouch from his coat. "It can block telemetry, comm uplinks, even real-time cockpit feed, if calibrated right." Every syllable struck the air like a hammer. What Dominion Airlines had framed as a compliance protocol had just escalated into federal sabotage. This wasn't damage control anymore. This was a covert takedown, planned, planted, and precision executed. Across the aisle, Trent Doran's chest rose and fell rapidly. His eyes darted from the flashlight to the cockpit door. Then, like a dam breaking, he moved. Fast! He lurched down the aisle, shoulder-checking a tray carved out of his way as he made a desperate dash toward the cockpit. Thurin raised his hand slowly. "If he touches that door," he said, voice low but cutting, "the entire aircraft locks down under dual security protocol." The effect was instant. Trent froze mid-stride, hand inches from the cockpit handle. His head snapped around to Thurin, sweat clinging to his temple. The intercom cracked to life overhead. "This is Captain Doss." The voice came, thin and uncertain. "I need a clear report. Is this aircraft being hijacked?" Thurin didn't hesitate. He walked forward, his footsteps loud against the tension. When he reached the cockpit threshold, he stood tall and met the captain's stunned gaze through the partially open door. "No," Thurin said, his voice stripped of emotion. "Only by the people you hired." He didn't wait for a response. Instead, he handed the micromodulator to Drellin, who silently sealed it into the evidence pouch and marked it with a federal tag. Behind them, a nervous silence swept the cabin like a second wave. The passengers weren't just watching, they were processing, recording, whispering. The idea that their flight was under attack not by outsiders, but by insiders, sent ripples of disbelief down every row. Thurin turned back to face the crew. His stance was steady, but his gaze burned with quiet precision. "From this moment," he said, his voice echoing down the aisle, "no one moves without authorization from either the Department of Transit or myself." Arlen, seated 2 rows back, tapped again on his wrist. Another burst of data streamed to the federal uplink. Trent was now visibly shaking. Redden Corin stood stiffly, his face blank, but his fists clenched by his sides. Aaron was nowhere in sight, likely already hiding behind whatever protocol shield he thought would protect him. "You want to make a statement," Thurin continued, now slowly pacing the center aisle, flanked by rows of wide-eyed passengers. "You wanted to demonstrate what happens when someone like me says no to your control scheme." His words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. The silence amplified them. "Your scheme wasn't about security," he went on. "It was about leverage, about performance, about sending a message before a vote you thought you could sway." Thurin stopped in front of Redden. The distance between them was no more than a foot. The tension was unbearable. Redden didn't look away. Neither did Thurin. "You use humiliation as a tool," Thurin said, his voice now barely above a whisper, thinking the man tied to a seat wouldn't have the strength to untie the truth. He leaned forward slightly, the lights catching the faint red marks still etched into his wrists. "Well, here's your demonstration, gentlemen," he said. "Not with restraints, not with fear, but with the system you never thought I'd turn against you." He gestured back to Drellin, who now stood near the forward lavatory, tapping on a secure tablet as more encrypted files transferred through the uplink. Trent sank slowly into an empty jump seat, face drained of color. And then Thurin turned back to Redden. He didn't blink, didn't move. "You wanted to make a statement." You wanted to demonstrate what happens when someone like me says no to your control scheme. He stepped closer, eyes unblinking. So let's finish the demonstration, with all of you as the example. The attendants smirked, confident their restraints and intimidation would control him, unaware that every move, every glance, and every passenger had already been accounted for by a CEO who never misses a detail. If you believe cruelty under privilege always folds when strategy meets power, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. Captain Laren Doss gripped the overhead panel just above his seat, his knuckles pale against the dim cockpit lighting. His voice cracked through the intercom, sharp and declarative. "This is Captain Doss. I'm assuming full control. I'm locking the cabin and preparing for an emergency diversion. I'm still in command." But even before the final word left his mouth, the cabin door clicked softly behind him. Dr. Thurin Voss stepped in a narrow threshold, separating the cockpit from a galley. His shoulders were squared, his face unreadable, and in the dim red glow of the manual override lights, he looked like the embodiment of silent authority. Without a word, he rolled up his left sleeve. The air shifted. Wrapped around Theron's wrist was a sleek, thin band of titanium alloy. Its surface shimmered faintly with a rotating cipher, an encrypted biometric ID sequence, verified only by federal systems. The room seemed to still around it. "I'm afraid not today," Thurin said, his voice calm, unhurried. Captain Doss turned slowly in his seat, brow furrowed, confusion giving way to visible dread. His gaze darted between Theron's face and the cipher, which was now pulsing blue in timed intervals. He had heard of such identifiers, rumors whispered during high-level compliance drills, but he never thought he'd see one up close. Outside the cockpit, passengers murmured as red cabin lights hummed softly. Arlen, seated in row 5, barely blinked as his fingers danced over his embedded seat console. The Veltrix uplink was still live. He had kept it active throughout the confrontation. One final command sent a secure handoff through federal satellite relays, bouncing over encrypted nodes until it reached Central Transit Command. Captain Doss's console flickered. A message blinked across his main panel in stark, official lettering. "Stand down. Obey Voss." He swallowed. Behind the run, the galley remained eerily still. Red and Corin had backed against the service wall. Aaron Vale and Trent Doran had already been corralled into the rear of the aircraft under Drellin Kane's watchful eye. The three men who had begun this act of spectacle were now shadows of their former bravado, exposed, defeated, and dangerously quiet. Doss's shoulders sagged. He turned off the emergency lock sequence and slowly lifted his hands from the flight yoke, letting them fall uselessly into his lap. You've rerouted command through Central? I didn't even know that was possible," he said, the edges of his voice now frayed. "It is," Thurin replied, stepping back out of the cockpit doorway. "You just never built your aircraft with integrity in mind." As he emerged into the aisle, the passengers broke into hesitant applause. Not loud, not theatrical, but respectful, cathartic, quiet claps of vindication. Some passengers nodded. A few wiped their eyes. Many had assumed Thurin was a criminal. A risk, a lesson in humiliation. But now the narrative was rewritten, live, midair, and irreversible. Thurin didn't bask in it. He turned to Arlen, who had already begun compiling the full transfer of the flight's command logs, crew comm transcripts, and the intercepted modulator's metadata for federal intake. The screen on the seatback display now pulsed with an updated message. "Flight reassignment complete." Redirecting to Harvin Terminal. Harvin Terminal wasn't just an airport. It was a federal processing zone used exclusively for aviation investigations, security handovers, and high-profile transit incidents requiring immediate legal scrutiny. Thurin had chosen it for one reason: transparency without delay. He walked down the aisle slowly. The same aisle he'd been marched through as a restrained man less than an hour ago. Every step now felt deliberate, consecrated. "Where are we going?" Trent Doran asked, voice brittle, as he was guided toward the back row. "Harvin Terminal," Drellin replied, "where you'll be formally introduced to your choices." Redden didn't speak at all. He merely slumped into the rear seat, eyes unfocused, lips slightly parted, as if trying to wake from a nightmare that hadn't ended yet. Aaron stared out the window, avoiding everyone. Thurin returned to seat 3A. He paused for a brief moment, placing his hand on the armrest, the same one his wrist had been zip-tied to. He sat down slowly, not because it was necessary, not because it was protocol, but because it meant something. This seat, once forced upon him as a symbol of submission, had become the throne of his restoration. A quiet place where power had returned not through retaliation, but through structure, through law. He looked to Arlen, who now had 3 screens open and was syncing the footage to multiple secure archives. "Let the cameras roll," Thurin said quietly, adjusting his cuff. "I want the public to see how you dismantle corruption, without raising your voice, without losing control." When Dominion Flight 712 touched down at Harbin Terminal, it didn't taxi toward the typical concourse filled with ground crews and baggage carts. Instead, it rolled slowly toward a distant, sealed gate, a federal docking corridor rarely used except for high-clearance inspections. Floodlights bathed the tarmac in pale white, and a line of unmarked dark vehicles flanked the perimeter. Standing before the air bridge were agents from the Federal Passenger Integrity Unit, aviation auditors in gray coats, and 3 senior compliance officers whose presence alone confirmed that what had happened on board had triggered an immediate and unprecedented response. Inside the aircraft, the mood was taut and reverent. Not a single crew member moved without watching their Voss from the corner of their eye. Redden sat with his hands clenched tightly on his knees. Trent's once cocky posture had deflated entirely, his eyes darting with restless guilt. And Aaron Vale, arms crossed but trembling slightly, stared dead ahead, his jaw locked in silent disbelief. Gone was the authority they had flaunted during boarding. All that remained was the kind of silence that begged not to be noticed. Thurin stood at the front of the aircraft, near the galley, his posture calm but commanding. He hadn't spoken in minutes. He didn't need to. The cabin had already become a courtroom without walls. Every passenger a silent witness. Every glance a form of testimony. When the door finally opened and a federal agent boarded, there was no announcement, no formal greeting, just a nod to the run and a quiet gesture toward the air bridge. As Thurin stepped off the plane, the hallway was already lined with cameras and flashbulbs flashing behind the glass partitions. News outlets had received anonymous uploads, the footage from Arlen's encrypted transmission. Screens across the country now showed a looping split. On the left, Thurin tied in seat 3A, still and dignified. On the right, the moment Drellin Kane cut the ties and Thurin stood to reclaim control. The world had already begun drawing its own conclusions. But Thurin didn't address the press. Not yet. He moved forward deliberately, carrying a small black evidence case in one hand. He was met at the terminal entrance by members of the federal investigation team. Wordlessly, he handed over the modulator device recovered from the crew locker, along with the internal comm logs extracted mid-flight and timestamps correlating to the override commands he had lawfully issued. The lead auditor, a stern man with silver at his temples, opened the case and nodded slowly, realizing the magnitude of what had been uncovered. "The story writes itself," Thurin said evenly, his tone neither smug nor vindictive, just factual, precise. Then came the moment that shifted the air entirely. A quiet man in a tailored Navy suit approached from the far end of the corridor, his ID badge clipped discreetly to his breast pocket. His name was Holland Marek, the legal liaison for Dominion's largest shareholder group. His walk was measured, practiced like someone who'd handled 100 crises, but was starting to suspect this wasn't just another one. He extended his hand toward Thurin, hesitantly. "Dr. Voss," he said, voice hushed, "I want to express that our board had no prior knowledge of this operation. We weren't aware they were going to target you." Thurin looked at the outstretched hand for a moment, but didn't take it. His expression didn't change. Cool, unreadable, controlled. He stepped a few inches closer, just enough that only Marek could hear him clearly. "Then your ignorance matches your risk," he said softly, but with razor-edged clarity. "Your stock's going free fall, and I won't catch it." Marek recoiled slightly, the gravity of the words hitting him harder than any raised voice could have. Before he could respond, the Wren had already turned his back and stepped away. Behind the glass, the press watched in reverent silence. Passengers slowly began disembarking, many holding phones to their chests instead of filming, out of respect, not fear. One by one, they passed the Wren. Some nodded. Others murmured quiet thanks. One older man, who had stared in horror during the restraint, simply said, "We saw. All of it. Thank you." Meanwhile, federal agents boarded the aircraft and escorted Redin, Aaron, and Trent off in silent procession. There were no cuffs yet, but the look in their eyes made it clear. Their flight careers had just ended. The same silence they had demanded from the Wren, under threat, under false compliance, now returned to suffocate them in shame. Arlen stood just behind the line of agents, tablet still in hand, silently monitoring the mirrored uplink feeds as they were archived into federal oversight records. He gave the Wren a nod, one a confirmation. Everything had been transmitted. Nothing would be buried. And the Wren? He didn't raise his voice. He didn't bask in victory. He simply stood, tall and silent, amid the wreckage of someone else's plan. He had not come for revenge. He had come for clarity. And now, surrounded by proof, protected by law, and seen by millions, he remained untouched by rage, only strengthened by restraint. "They tried to make me a warning," he muttered. "Now I'll become the law they didn't expect." The tribunal opened without ceremony. No delay, no warm greetings, no formal posturing. Just a gavel strike and a silence that carried weight. 3 federal judges, all male, flanked by 2 senior auditors from the Aviation Ethics Bureau, stared down the long conference table inside the sealed chamber of the Harvin Terminal Justice Wing. The walls were soundproof, reinforced for confidentiality, and lined with flat displays showing synchronized footage from Dominion Flight 712. On the center monitor, a freeze frame of the Wren Vos, wrists zip-tied, eyes forward, his cuff slightly raised to reveal the code key. Across the room sat the accused, Redin Corin, Trent Doran, and Aaron Vale. Their faces were stiff with a mixture of regret and fear, but no apology had yet passed their lips. Dern didn't wait for invitation. He stood from his seat at the far end, adjusted his collar, and placed a small black case on the table. Contained inside, he said clearly, are 6 encrypted drives. Each contains layered telemetry pulled in real time from Veltrix's uplink system embedded on Flight 712. He unlocked the case with a biometric scan. This data confirms deliberate targeting, unlawful restraint, and sabotage involving a signal modulator hidden in crew storage. He looked directly at the panel. But it's not just the devices or restraints. It's the intention behind them. And that intention goes deeper than these 3 men. A hushed murmur moved through the room. One of the judges leaned forward. "Are you implying this was not a spontaneous act?" Theron's gaze never wavered. "I'm stating it outright. This was a premeditated maneuver orchestrated by Dominion's internal lobbying division, its shadow arm. The purpose, to discredit and disempower me ahead of next week's vote on the Viraline Protocol. A vote that would have denied them their flagship surveillance expansion across federal routes." Judge Halvar Vernine folded his hands. "And you have evidence?" EDO. Passenger uploads. Cabin comm intercepts. Uplinked administrative packet loops from the crew's closed channel. And testimony from the undercover federal auditor seated in row 9, Mr. Drellenkane. Drellen stood. "Everything Dr. Voss said aligns with my own observation logs. I was embedded for risk analysis. Never expected we'd catch them mid-act." The tribunal wasted no time cross-referencing timestamps. With each synchronized clip, Redin joking near the galley, Trent smirking with his boot against the aisle, Aaron issuing falsified compliance orders, the courtroom grew colder. Even the defense representatives, assigned by Dominion's legal team, stopped taking notes. They knew. The walls were closing in. But it was the modulator, the flashlight-concealed signal dampener, that delivered the final blow. Inside its casing, a micromodulated diode specifically calibrated to jam federal uplinks while keeping flight operations unaffected. Dominion had funded prototypes like this before, but only for testing, never for use. This wasn't about enforcement, Thurin said. It was about message control. They didn't just tie me to a chair. They tried to tie the entire future of passenger oversight to fear, to theater, to humiliation. The judge at center nodded. And instead, you countered the demonstration. I didn't plan for that, Thurin admitted. But I was prepared. There's a difference. What followed was a string of rapid decisions. The tribunal unanimously ruled Dominion Airlines in breach of multiple federal mandates: passenger dignity, compliance manipulation, and internal sabotage. The ruling was read aloud as the accused sat in silence, heads lowered, breath shallow. Effective immediately, the head auditor declared, Dominion Airlines is barred from bidding on or participating in any federal aviation contracts for a minimum term of 5 years. Their internal compliance division will be restructured under third-party supervision, with quarterly audits enforced. A pause. Then, crew members Redden Corin, Trent Doran, and Aaron Vale are permanently banned from employment in all sectors of commercial aviation. The sentence rang through the chamber like a bell toll, a final note of reckoning. But Thurin didn't move. Not yet. He turned slightly toward the gallery where a few observers sat, agency officials, legal clerks, and quietly recording correspondents. He saw no triumph in their eyes, only anticipation, as if waiting to see if he'd exact revenge or offer something higher. He stepped forward once more. You think this is over? He asked, voice steady. This isn't about my chair. This isn't about one airline. This is about what happens when silence is made into protocol. When power is used to shame, not to serve. I'm not here for revenge. He pointed to the screen, now displaying a still of passengers watching silently as he was zip-tied. I'm here because the people on that plane needed someone to remind them that silence is complicity. And that law, true law, starts not when things are peaceful, but when someone resists being humiliated for saying no. Judge Vernine stood. And what would you have us take from all this, Dr. Voss? Thurin didn't hesitate. Accountability isn't a punishment, he said. It's a mirror. If you can't look into it without flinching, you don't belong in the sky. The clip had crossed 10 million views by the time Thurin Voss stepped into the panel chamber at the Federal Aviation Oversight Council. Not with a lawyer, not with a press team. Alone. The room, packed with advisors, airline lobbyists, and skeptical policymakers, fell into a hush. Most had seen the intercom footage, Thurin standing zip-tied, then standing tall. His calm voice had cut through the fear like a scalpel. Now, that same voice was here for something far more dangerous than confrontation: reform. He wasted no time. This isn't about what happened to me, he said, placing a small metal case on the table. It's about what's allowed to happen to all of us until someone says no. Inside the case were the first drafts of the Passenger Dignity Initiative. Every page was printed with the proposed regulations. Body cams required for all boarding crew, automatic federal review triggers for any in-flight restraint, mandatory cabin comms, archiving accessible to a neutral oversight body. One executive in the back exhaled sharply. Another leaned to whisper, if this passes, half our disciplinary procedures are dead. Thurin looked up. Good. Then they should be. For all his restraint aboard Flight 712, here's words hit harder. Not loud. Not angry. Surgical. Clean. He knew how to leave bruises without shouting. Your policies rely on silence and spectacle, he continued. You scare passengers into submission. You classify dissent as threat. You put loyalty above legality. That ends today. A council member adjusted his mic. And how do you propose we enforce such sweeping transparency? Thurin nodded once to Arlen, seated quietly near the media bench. Arlen tapped a device, and the room's main screen blinked to life. It wasn't a presentation. It was a live passenger comment board, real-time uploads from citizens who'd watched the Flight 712 clip. One man's message appeared first. I travel twice a month. If that can happen to him, it can happen to me. Then another. He didn't raise his voice, but he raised ours. Then came the one Thurin had already memorized. My 10-year-old asked me why I didn't help him. I had no answer, but I'll never stay quiet again. Theron's eyes didn't blink. as the message faded. That, he said, is why you don't need more power. You need more mirrors. The line hit harder than any policy point. Around the room, the atmosphere shifted. Some adjusted their posture. Others typed notes faster. But resistance was still thick. From the back, a man rose, Counselor Garandelv, a longtime industry ally. This is emotional theater. The aviation sector doesn't need guilt. It needs order. The Wren turned, but didn't flinch. Then we disagree on the definition of order. Outside the chamber, reporters were already gathering, screens buzzing with new leaks. Airlines were privately circulating memos, downplay Voss, discredit the footage, delay the initiative, but they were too late. In the digital sphere, the Wren wasn't just a man with proposals. He was a movement, fueled by restraint, shaped by humiliation, and now wielding power with the same quiet control that had once unnerved the crew who zip-tied him. Later that night, during a broadcast interview, the host read aloud the now-famous comment from the father. My 10-year-old asked me why I didn't help him. Theron's jaw tightened slightly. He didn't blink, didn't smile, but his voice, when it came, was low and final. That's all the justice I need, he said. One father teaching his son the truth. The room stood still the moment Duran Voss stepped onto the stage. No dramatic intro, no announcer, just the soft tread of polished shoes over the marble floor of Norvan City's Grand Summit Hall, a venue usually reserved for trade accords and prime minister visits. The air was chilled, not from temperature but tension. A tension wrapped around every executive, regulator, and advisor seated before him. He carried no notes, no slideshow. Only a small, sealed case in his left hand and the faintest stiffness in his wrist, still recovering from the scars left by Dominion Flight 712. He stepped up to the podium without hesitation, adjusted the mic, and scanned the room. Among the crowd sat airline CEOs in charcoal suits, compliance chiefs fidgeting with their badges, and transit lawmakers who had once dismissed his warnings as paranoia. Many had hoped he would decline the keynote invitation. Some expected vengeance. Others expected spectacle. What they got instead was precision. When restraint is violated, Duran began, his voice calm, firm, and deliberate. It is rarely loud. Abuse hides best in protocol, behind the theater of compliance. No one moved. Every syllable carried weight, slicing through the silent auditorium like a scalpel. A few scribes glanced up from their notepads. The room felt as if it were holding its breath. I was tied to a seat by men who believed their titles protected them. But it wasn't just my body they were targeting. It was the idea that accountability could sit among them undetected. I wasn't attacked for who I am. I was attacked for what I represented. He paused, and the lights above flickered slightly, like the cabin lights had before the override. Someone coughed. Another scribbled furiously. Duran opened the case slowly and pulled out what looked like a framed metal panel. The sound of the latch echoed, unsettlingly loud. This, he said, raising it, is from seat 3A. Gasps murmured through the crowd. A long, rectangular strip of brushed aluminum, torn from the base plate of the very seat he had been zip-tied to, now mounted in a transparent frame. Beneath it, laser-etched into the base, were the words, "Power is what they took. Discipline is what I kept." He let it rest on the podium edge. Some leaned forward to see. Others averted their eyes. I didn't raise my voice on that flight, Duran continued, hands now resting gently on either side of the frame. Not because I was afraid, but because I want to make it clear discipline is not silence. Discipline is pressure held back with purpose. There was a tremble in the jaw of one senior airline compliance director. Another executive shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the quote from the tribunal hearing transcript that had gone viral weeks earlier. Duran scanned the audience again. His tone never rose, but it didn't need to. In an era where automation masks intent and chain of command absolves consequence, we have crafted a culture where just following orders is seen as a defense. I am here to tell you it is not. A brief silence followed. Then he turned the page emotionally, without theatrics. You will try to legislate your way out of this moment. Write memos. Launch internal task forces. paint a better logo on the side of your aircraft. But none of that will restore the dignity you stripped when you let silence become your safety net. He stepped back, letting the plaque remain center stage, visible to all. The gesture was symbolic. He wasn't the focus anymore. What had been done was. Then, with a final glance around the hall, he added, "If your authority rests on who can't speak back, then your entire system is already falling." A beat, and then it came applause. Not immediate. It took a moment for the first to rise, then the next. But when it did, it surged raw, authentic, almost uncomfortable. Not just an appreciation, but an acknowledgement. The applause rolled through the chamber, not like thunder, but like rainfall hitting glass, precise, necessary, cleansing. Durin Vos didn't bow. He didn't smile. He gave a short nod and turned to leave the stage as quietly as he had arrived. Behind him, the plaque shimmered under the stage light. Airline CEOs, policy advisors, and aviation regulators stood not because they had to, but because they finally understood what had happened. Not a man being tied to a seat, but an empire of silence being unraveled by someone who refused to flinch. The ceremony began the moment Dr. Durin Vos stepped into Harvin Terminal's central hall. No announcements, no introductions, just the immediate hush that spread across the crowd like a ripple of recognition. The unveiling of the Vos line had drawn passengers, officials, and reporters, but none of them mattered as much as the quiet resonance of returning to the place where everything had changed. Durin walked forward with measured steps, his posture steady, his expression unreadable. The polished floor reflected the overhead lights, and for a breath, he felt as though he were walking toward his past, one that had been captured, broadcast, dissected, and ultimately transformed into a shield for millions who would never meet him. At the center of the hall stood the glass monument. Behind it, illuminated by soft white lighting, was Seat 3A, preserved exactly as it had been the day he was restrained. Not repaired, not polished. Every crease, every scuff, every place where the zip ties had pulled the armrests inward remained untouched. The inscription below read, "A chair can't define a man, but it could define a moment." Durin paused before it, letting the words settle. His reflection glimmered on the glass, layered over the seat, making it look as though his past and present were caught in the same frame. Arlen stood slightly behind him, hands clasped tightly, his breaths careful and controlled. Drellin Kane remained on the opposite side, posture straight, eyes trained on the crowd, not out of fear but out of habit. Members of the Integrity Council occupied the edges, watching quietly, aware that this unveiling was more than a symbol. It was a boundary, one that no airline, no supervisor, and no corrupted protocol would be allowed to cross again. As spectators gathered, Durin sensed an odd mix of admiration and guilt in their faces. They had seen his restraint. They had witnessed his silence. And many had realized how easily they might have stayed silent themselves. A small stir at his side pulled Durin from his thoughts. A young boy approached, no more than 9 or 10, holding his father's hand before letting go and stepping closer with hesitant courage. The hall dimmed slightly as the spotlight shifted, illuminating the boy's face, curious, earnest, trying to understand a story far bigger than himself. "Were you scared when they tied you up?" the boy asked softly, his voice carrying farther than expected in the stillness of the hall. Durin knelt beside him, lowering himself until they were eye level. "I was quiet," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "That's different than scared." The boy's brows furrowed, and he tilted his head as though weighing the meaning of the words. Durin saw a reflection of the countless passengers who had admitted, months later, that they hadn't understood the difference until the footage forced them to face it. "Why didn't you yell?" the boy asked. His voice trembled, not out of fear, but because he was asking something he truly wanted to understand. Durin smiled faintly, a tired but resolute smile shaped by the memory of compression straps, mocking voices, and the hum of an aircraft that carried more secrets than passengers. "Because yelling changes noise," he said, placing a hand gently on the boy's shoulder. "But silence backed by action, changes laws." The boy nodded slowly, as though storing the words for the rest of his life. Arlen looked away for a moment, eyes shining, while Drellin's jaw tightened with quiet pride. It was the kind of moment that marked a man far more deeply than headlines ever could. As the urn rose, applause began, not explosive, not dramatic, but steady and sincere. Men across the hall nodded. Some saluted. Others placed hands on their hearts. None of them needed speeches to understand why this moment mattered. The Wren adjusted his cuff, smoothing the fabric as he turned toward the massive window overlooking the runways. Aircraft rolled by in deliberate rhythm, machines he had helped design, governed by systems he had fought to protect from corruption. The sunlight caught the glass of the monument and split into faint reflections that stretched across the hall like crossing paths. The Wren followed one of those reflections toward the runway horizon, feeling an old tension loosen in his chest. The seat behind the glass would remain frozen in time, but he had not. They thought tying me down would end something, he whispered, the quiet words carrying across the room with an almost prophetic weight. But it was the start of everything. Within 15 minutes, his calm calculation turned into decisive action. No mercy was given, no mistake went unpunished, and the cabin watched in silent awe. If you believe real authority strikes with precision, intelligence, and unstoppable force, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores racism, abuse of authority, and the power of standing up with intelligence and strategy. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage reflection on justice, accountability, and maintaining dignity under pressure.